My wife demanded my $4.2 million inheritance, but I refused. My name is Harold Whitcomb, and at 63 years old, I genuinely believed I knew the woman I'd shared a bed with for 31 years. I was wrong about that. The way a man can be wrong about the weather right before a storm rolls across the Nullarbor and changes everything he thought he understood about the sky. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late March when I got the phone call that ended my marriage. I was standing in the car park of a regional hardware store in Wagga Wagga on the back end of a 4-day business trip, loading bags of fertilizer into the boot of my old Holden Ute when my mobile rang. The screen lit up with my wife's name. I almost didn't answer. I'd told her I'd ring when I got back to the motel, and there was something about the timing of her calls lately that put a knot in my chest before I'd even said hello. But I picked up. Of course I picked up. A man married 31 years still picks up. "Harold," she said, and there was a brightness in her voice I hadn't heard in months. A nasty kind of brightness, like the gleam off a knife. "I've done it. I've finally done it. The bulldozers came this morning. Your parents' house is gone, flattened. There's nothing left but a pile of bricks and that old veranda railing your father was so proud of. The Donnellys are in temporary housing now. They'll be in a shelter by the weekend, I should think. I hope you're happy with what you put me through, because this is what your stubbornness has cost you." I stood there in the car park with a 40-kilo bag of fertilizer balanced against my hip, and I started to laugh. I couldn't help it. I laughed until my eyes watered, until the young bloke loading his trailer 2 spots down looked over at me like I'd lost the plot entirely. "Why are you laughing?" my wife said, and her voice had changed now. Thinner, sharper. "Harold, why the hell are you laughing?" "Margaret," I said, when I could finally catch my breath. "Margaret, my love, you'd better sit down. There's a few things about that house I never got around to telling you." She hung up on me. I stood in that car park for a long while afterwards, watching the heat haze rise off the bitumen, and I thought about how strange it was that 31 years of marriage could end on a Tuesday afternoon between a bag of fertilizer and a flock of galas squabbling on a power line above my head. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is where you'll understand how a quiet bloke from a sheep station outside Bathurst ended up outsmarting his own wife and saving his parents' legacy from the woman who'd vowed to share it with him. I grew up on a property called Wirrabura, about 40 minutes west of Bathurst in central New South Wales. My parents, Ronald and Edith Whitcomb, ran sheep on 1,000 acres of yellow grass and red soil, and they raised me to believe in 3 things: hard yakka, honest dealings, and the sanctity of the land beneath your feet. My father had inherited Wirrabura from his father, and his father from his, and the homestead itself had been built in 1898, from sandstone, hauled by bullock dray from a quarry near Lithgow. That house had stood through droughts and floods, through the Great War and the Depression, through bushfires that scorched the paddocks black and rains that turned the creek into a brown rolling thing that took fences and dead sheep with it. That house was, to my way of thinking, the most permanent thing in my world. I met Margaret in 1994, when I was 32 years old and she was 29. I'd come down to Sydney for a livestock conference, and she was working the front desk at the hotel where I'd booked my room. She had this laugh that made you want to say something funny just so you could hear it again, and a way of looking at you like you were the only bloke in the room worth her time. I was a country fellow, a bit rough around the edges, and I'd never been good with women. Margaret made me feel like I was. We were married 18 months later in a little chapel in the Blue Mountains, and I brought her home to Wirrabura to start our life together. The trouble started, I suppose, the moment her boots touched the dirt of that station. She didn't say anything at first. She was too clever for that. But I saw the way she looked at the homestead with its sagging veranda and its rust-spotted iron roof, and I saw the way her shoulders tightened when she walked through paddocks where the flies hung in clouds and the smell of sheep was thick in the heat. She wanted Sydney. She'd always wanted Sydney. And though she tried for the better part of a decade to make a go of it on the land, by the time I was 45, she'd worn me down to the point where we sold off most of the flock, leased out the paddocks, and bought a modest brick veneer in a leafy suburb of Sydney's lower North Shore. We kept the homestead, though. That was non-negotiable. My parents were still living, both in their late 70s by then, and Wirrabura was their home. We arranged for them to stay on in the main house, and we hired a manager to run what was left of the operation. Margaret didn't fight me on it. She seemed almost relieved, in fact, to have a clean break from the place. She got her city life and a husband who came home to her every night, and I got the comfort of knowing my parents would die in the house they'd loved. For 16 years, that's how it went. I worked as a regional sales rep for a farm machinery company. Margaret took a job at a real estate agency in Mossman, where she discovered, to her great delight, that she had a natural gift for selling expensive houses to wealthy people. We never had children. That was a sorrow we shared in different ways, hers loud and mine quiet, but we'd long since made our peace with it. Our nieces and nephews filled the gap, more or less. We had a comfortable life. A good life, I'd have said, if you'd asked me 3 years ago. Then my father died. It was the autumn of my 61st year, and he went the way all good men hope to go. In his sleep, in his own bed, with the morning light coming through the window, and the magpies caroling in the gum tree outside. My mother followed him 8 months later, more from heartbreak than from any specific illness, though the doctor wrote down congestive heart failure on the certificate. I buried them side by side in the little cemetery at the Anglican church in Bathurst, and I came home to Sydney a different man than the one who'd left. It was then that I learned, for the first time, the full extent of what my parents had left me. The solicitor's office was up a flight of stairs above a pharmacy on the main street of Bathurst. The solicitor was a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Tasker, who'd handled my parents' affairs for over 20 years. She poured me a cup of tea, and she sat down across from me with a manila folder thick as a phone book. "Harold," she said, "your father was a man who didn't talk about money, but he was very careful with it. There are some things in here you may not have known about. The land alone was worth nearly $2 million. The cattle and remaining sheep, the machinery, the outbuildings, another $400,000. And then there was the surprise. My father, it turned out, had spent 40 years quietly investing in a portfolio of mining shares and government bonds, the way some old country blokes do, never trusting the markets but never quite trusting the bank either. The portfolio had grown, with reinvested dividends and a couple of lucky punts on iron ore back in the early 2000s, to just over $1.8 million. $4.2 million. All up. To a man who'd never had more than $90,000 in the bank at any one time. The number felt unreal. It felt like something that belonged to someone else. Some other Harold who'd lived a different life. I drove home to Sydney that evening, and I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret, and I told her everything. I watched her face as I spoke. I watched her go very still, the way a fox goes still when it spots a rabbit in the grass. And I should have known right then that something had changed in her. But I didn't see it, or I didn't want to see it. There's a difference, and I've had a lot of time since then to think about which one it was. $4.2 million, she said softly, when I was done. Harold, do you know what this means? It means we're set up nicely for retirement, I said. It means we don't have to worry. It means we can finally live, she said. And her eyes were bright. It means we can have the life we should have been having all along. Within a week, she'd started talking about a waterfront property at Pittwater. Within a fortnight, she'd dragged me to 3 open inspections of houses I had no interest in. Houses with marble splashbacks and infinity pools and price tags that started at $4 million and went up from there. By the end of the month, she was on first-name terms with a buyer's agent. And the conversation at our kitchen table had stopped being a conversation. It had become a campaign. "Sell Wirrabura," she said one Sunday morning in June, over poached eggs. "Just sell it. The land alone will get us most of the way there, and we can borrow against the share portfolio for the rest." "Harold, please. I'm 60 years old. I've waited my whole life for this. The Donnellys are still living there," I said. The Donnellys were the elderly couple who'd taken over the homestead after my parents passed. Norman Donnelly was 78. His wife Iris was 76. They'd been my parents' neighbors for 40 years on the adjoining property, and when their son had sold the family farm out from under them and moved them into a retirement village in Orange, they'd lasted exactly 4 months before Norman had had a minor stroke. My mother, in the last weeks of her life, had made me promise that the Donnellys could live at Wirrabura for as long as they needed. I'd put it in writing. They paid a peppercorn rent of $200 a month, and they kept the gardens and they fed the few sheep my father had still been running at the time of his death. "Then move them out," Margaret said. "Give them notice. Surely there are aged care facilities. They've got nowhere to go," I said. And I gave my mother my word. "Your mother is dead," she said. And the way she said it made me put down my fork. That was the first time I really looked at my wife and saw a stranger sitting across the table from me. The arguments got worse over the following months. She wanted me to evict the Donnellys. She wanted me to sell Wirrabura. She wanted me to liquidate the share portfolio. She had a vision, she said, of the life we deserved. And the only thing standing between her and that life was my stubbornness, my sentimentality, my country-bred refusal to move with the times. She made appointments with property developers without telling me. She forwarded me listings of luxury properties at all hours of the day. She started speaking about Wirrabura with a kind of contempt that made my stomach turn over, calling it that God-forsaken sheep paddock, calling my parents' house a tumble-down shack. I tried to be patient. I tried to explain. And then, one evening in late February, I came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a manila envelope in front of her. Inside the envelope was a quote from a demolition company in Bathurst. "What is this?" I said. "It's a solution," she said. "If we knock the house down, the land is more valuable, subdividable. The Donnellys would have to leave, and once it's gone, you won't have anything to be sentimental about anymore. We can sell, Harold. We can finally sell." I took that envelope and I tore it in half and I dropped it in the bin. And I told my wife, in language plainer than I'd used in 31 years of marriage, that I would never demolish my parents' house, that I would never evict the Donnellys, and that if she so much as set foot on Wirrabura without my permission, she would be answering to the law. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she smiled. It was a small, tight smile, the kind a person gives you when they've just made a decision they're not going to share. "Of course, Harold," she said. "I understand." That was 3 weeks before the Bulldozers arrived. Now, here's the part of the story I haven't told you yet. The part that explains why I laughed in that hardware store car park when my wife rang to tell me she'd flattened my parents' homestead. I'm a country bloke. I was raised by a man who'd lived through the Depression and a mother who could stretch a leg of mutton across 9 days of meals. I grew up watching my father deal with bank managers and stock agents and shifty buyers from the city. And the one thing he taught me, over and over, was that you never sign anything you haven't read 3 times, and you never trust anyone with anything you can't afford to lose. When Margaret had started talking about waterfront properties, when the buyer's agent had appeared in our lives, when the conversations at our kitchen table had begun to feel less like conversations and more like negotiations conducted by an opposing solicitor, I had done what my father would have done. I had got quiet. I had got watchful. And I had started making preparations. The first thing I did, about 4 months before the Bulldozers came, was hire a private investigator. I'd never done such a thing in my life. and I felt grubby about it for weeks. But the things I was finding in our shared email account had got me worried. Margaret had been corresponding with a man in Mosman, a property developer named Lindsay Calvert, with whom she seemed to have an arrangement of some sort. The emails were carefully worded, but the gist was clear enough. Once the inheritance was liquidated and the new property purchased, there were going to be developments in Margaret's life that I was not going to be part of. The investigator confirmed what I already suspected. My wife had been having an affair with Calvert for over 2 years. She'd opened a separate bank account I didn't know about. She'd consulted a divorce solicitor in November, 4 months before our argument about the demolition. The second thing I did was move the share portfolio. I worked with Mrs. Tasker, my parents' solicitor, and a financial advisor in Bathurst, and over the course of 3 months I quietly transferred the entire $1.8 million into an irrevocable trust in my own name only. The trust was structured so that Margaret had no legal claim to it whatsoever, regardless of any future divorce proceedings. My father had set it up that way years before, anticipating, I think, exactly this kind of trouble. Inheritances, in our state, are not automatically considered marital property if they're kept separate. Mine had been kept separate. Mine was going to stay separate. The third thing I did, and this is the part that gave me the laugh in the hardware store car park, was deal with the homestead itself. The original sandstone house at Wirrabura was over 120 years old. It was heritage listed. It had been heritage listed since 1987, when my father had quietly applied to have it registered with the New South Wales Heritage Council, partly out of pride, and partly, I suspect, because he had a feeling about the kind of woman I might end up marrying. A heritage-listed building cannot be demolished. Not legally, not without a court order that takes years to obtain and almost never succeeds. Anyone who knocks down a heritage-listed building without authorization is committing a serious criminal offense under the Heritage Act, with penalties of up to $1.1 million and several years in prison. I had not told my wife the homestead was heritage listed. She had never asked. But that wasn't the cleverest part. The cleverest part was this. In January, 6 weeks before the Bulldozers arrived, I had moved the Donnellys out of the homestead and into a small cottage on the western edge of the property, a former shearer's quarters that I'd had renovated for them. I'd told Margaret nothing about this. As far as she knew, the Donnellys were still in the main house. As far as she knew, demolishing the homestead would mean destroying the home of 2 elderly people and putting them on the street. The cruelty of her choice, when she made it, was the cruelty of a woman who believed she was making elderly tenants homeless. Now, here's the question. If she was so determined to demolish the place, what stopped her doing it whenever she wanted? Why wait for me to be in Wagga Wagga? The answer, I learned later from the police report, was that she'd needed me out of the way to forge my signature on the demolition authorization. The company she'd hired was a small outfit out of Lithgow that had cut corners on the paperwork. They'd accepted a forged authorization form, a forged copy of my driver's license, and a deposit paid in cash. They had not checked the heritage register. They had not contacted me directly. By the time they realized what they'd done, it was Tuesday afternoon. The homestead was a pile of rubble, and my wife was ringing me from a service station near Bathurst to deliver what she believed would be the worst news of my life. I drove home to Sydney that evening. I didn't speed. I didn't rage. I stopped at a pub in Cowra, and I had a counter meal of lamb shanks and a single schooner of beer, and I rang Mrs. Tasker from the car park afterwards to let her know that the time had come. By the time I walked through my front door, just before midnight, the wheels were already turning. Mrs. Tasker had filed a report with the Heritage Council. A criminal investigation was opening into the demolition. The police had been notified. Calvert, my wife's lover, had been informed by his own solicitor that any property he'd been planning to purchase jointly with my wife was now subject to a freeze pending the outcome of multiple legal proceedings. Margaret was sitting on the lounge in her dressing gown when I came in. She'd been crying. The brightness was gone from her face, and what remained was something pinched and frightened that I almost felt sorry for. Almost. "Harold," she said, "whatever you think you know, we can talk about this. We can work it out." "Margaret," I said, "I'd like you to listen to me very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." I sat down across from her, the way I'd sat down across from her at our kitchen table. 31 years of mornings and evenings, and I told her what I knew. I told her about Lindsay Calvert. I told her about the secret bank account. I told her about the divorce solicitor she'd consulted in November. I told her about the trust that now held the entire share portfolio beyond any reach she might attempt through the family court. I told her that the homestead she'd demolished was heritage listed and that she was looking at criminal charges that could result in a prison sentence of up to several years and fines that would consume any divorce settlement she might hope to receive. And then I told her about the Donnellys. I told her where they'd been living for the past 6 weeks. I told her that the only thing she'd actually destroyed was an empty house, and that the elderly couple she'd thought she was casting onto the street had been safe in a renovated cottage on the other side of the property, watching the dust rise on the morning of the demolition through their kitchen window with a cup of tea in their hands. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was very small. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to do what my father would have done," I said. "I'm going to let the law handle the parts the law handles, and I'm going to handle the rest myself. You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow morning, you'll need to find somewhere else to live." The criminal proceedings took 11 months. My wife pleaded guilty in the end, on the advice of her solicitor, to the destruction of a heritage-listed building and to attempted fraud relating to the forged authorization. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of my own mother, took into account my wife's lack of prior convictions and her age in delivering the sentence. 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9. A fine of $350,000, payable to the Heritage Council. Court costs of a further $60,000. Restitution to me for the destroyed property of an additional $200,000, secured against any future earnings. The divorce, by comparison, was almost simple. With the share portfolio safely in trust and Wirrabura itself classified as inherited property, the assets available for division were the Sydney house and a few joint accounts. My wife got half of those, which was more than I'd have given her if I'd had any say in it. But that's how the law works in this country, and I'd long since made my peace with it. By the time she went to prison, she had her half of the proceeds from the Sydney house, minus the fines and costs and restitution, which left her with about $40,000 to her name. Lindsay Calvert, of course, had vanished from her life the moment the criminal charges became public. She wrote me a letter from the Women's Correctional Facility about 6 months into her sentence, asking for forgiveness, asking for a second chance, asking me to remember the woman she'd been when we were young. I read it twice. Then I put it in a drawer, and I never wrote back. Wirrabura is still there. The cottage where the Donnellys live is still there. Norman is 81 now, and Iris is 79, and the two of them potter about in the vegetable garden in the cool of the morning and sit on the veranda in the evenings, watching the sun set red and slow over the western paddocks. The site where the homestead stood is being rebuilt, slowly, using as much of the original sandstone as we could salvage from the rubble. The Heritage Council is overseeing the reconstruction. It won't be the original house, exactly, but it will be close enough, and when I stand on the foundation stones at dusk, I can almost hear my father whistling somewhere in the back kitchen and my mother calling me in for tea. I'm 63 years old. I live alone in the Sydney house, though I spend more weekends at Wirrabura these days than I used to. I've taken up wood turning. I've started reading the kinds of books I never had time for. I rang my older sister, who lives in Adelaide, and I apologized for the long stretches when I hadn't been in touch. And she cried, and we've been ringing each other every Sunday since. There is, I've found, a kind of peace that comes to a man on the far side of betrayal, a peace that has nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the simple understanding that you have survived something you didn't think you could survive. Now, before I go, I want to say a few things to anyone listening who might be in a situation like mine, or who knows someone who is. The first thing is this. When the people closest to you start treating your family's history like an obstacle in their way, listen carefully. They are telling you something important about who they have become. My wife didn't wake up one morning and decide to demolish my parents' house. She arrived at that decision over many years, through many small conversations in which I told myself I was overreacting, that I was being sentimental, that she didn't really mean it. She did really mean it. People, in the end, do mean what they say. The second thing is this. Protect the things that cannot be replaced. Land, houses, memories, letters from the dead. The law in this country is a marvelous thing, but it is slow, and the time to put protections in place is long before you think you'll need them. My father heritage listed our homestead in 1987. He could not have known that 38 years later, that simple piece of paperwork would save the building from a daughter-in-law he'd never quite trusted. Do the paperwork. Trust your instincts. Set up the trusts and the protections while you still can. The third thing is this. Old people are not disposable. The Donnellys were not in my way. They were not a problem to be solved. They were two human beings who had loved my parents and who had nowhere else to go. And any society that treats its elderly as obstacles to be removed is a society that has lost its soul. We are all, every one of us, going to be old one day. If we're lucky, remember that. And the fourth thing, and the last thing, is this. A man's legacy is not his money. It is not his house. It is not even his land. A man's legacy is the way he treated the people who couldn't fight back. My father's legacy is Norman and Iris Donnelly sitting on a veranda at dusk, watching the sun go down over paddocks that don't belong to them, in a cottage that nobody can take away from them as long as I'm drawing breath. That's the inheritance I really received. The $4.2 million was just numbers. The Donnellys were the real fortune. Margaret got out of prison last month. I heard from a cousin that she's living in a unit in Newcastle, working part-time at a charity shop. I wish her no ill. I wish her nothing at all, in fact. Which is perhaps the cleanest ending a long marriage can have. She made her choices. I made mine. The house we both wanted was never the same house in the end. And I think we both knew that long before the Bulldozers came. If you're watching this, and you've made it all the way to the end, I want to thank you for keeping an old bloke company for an hour or so. Tell the people you love that you love them while you still can. Forgive the ones who deserve forgiveness, and walk away clean from the ones who don't. And whatever you do, don't ever let anyone convince you that the past is something to be bulldozed. The past is the foundation we stand on. Without it, we are nothing but dust in the wind, and the wind in this country can blow for a very long time indeed. Good night, and God bless.